get the sharing stream, and this takes us just a few moments here, but then we'll get into our questions here a little bit. Moment here. So. All right. All right. Waiting.
Thanks, Nancy, for having my back.
All right.
You're walking home. Euclid is far from here.
Well, the highway's not too far. 271, she could just, or 77, just a
Do you have a skirt?
thumb.
Because you're gonna need to hike it up and put your thumb out to get your ride back.
Let's see here.
He was trying to strangle Laura in that area.
Yeah, isn't that rude, disrespectful?
No, because it wouldn't, there would be a lot of people that would back me.
Nuh-uh.
Oh, come on here.
I don't think it's fun.
You ever notice they make these things harder and harder to find out where the little X is to get rid of your things? Because it's right where I need to click, and I can't click there because I don't know where the X is.
Make it smaller and older than
Oh my gosh.
No, they're hiding them by like making the color the same as the background color. And when you think you have it, no, it's I have something I need to share, and I can't X out this ad because there's always an X on them, but it's hidden, and I haven't found it yet. So that one will have to wait. Let me make sure here I got it's just all right. We'll go back to this then. If there was a simpler way to do this, I'd be glad to do it, but it just takes a few minutes to get everything shared over at the start. That's what it feels like sometimes.
Don't listen
We're-
to them.
Oh, that's not right.
So how about those Guardians?
The what's?
They
The
lost
what's?
first game.
The Deans?
They lost the first game on.
The Indians,
The Deans.
the Cleveland Indians.
All right, this is the problem when I have to do
Guys.
this here.
They gave him that
I'm so
political correctness,
Yeah.
All right.
Well, Disney World and everything.
I guess I got it there now.
It's been saying it for
Yeah,
2,000 years. Over 2,000.
yeah, Jesus said before your return, it'll be as it was in the days of Noah and the days of Lot. It sure heading that way, is it?
It sure is. Every
There
time
we
I
are.
wake up, it's crazy.
All right, I think we're about there now.
Faster and faster and faster. to
Yep.
that direction. You know, when they say, like they say in the last days that it's going to increase service. Look it up until 100 years ago. Horse, walk. Wheels got invented, cars. Now we-
All right.
we can-
I think we're set now. Hopefully. Unless something happens funny while we're doing this.
Something happens.
Something happens funny, yes.
Something funny happens.
Or something funny happens. All right. All right, and can you hold, and you got yours, and I got another question here too. So, what is yours? And I'll see which one will go faster.
Just a translation.
Yeah.
Of a name.
All right.
that I run
All right.
in Second Samuel.
2 Samuel.
Chapter 5.
Yeah, let me look that up here. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 5. And we'll get back to this one in a minute because this will take longer than the 2 Samuel name, I think. So 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 20. And we have
So,
David coming to Baal Perazim.
yeah. So, the translation I'm seeing here from Baal Perazim
Mm-hmm.
is Lord of Breaches.
Yeah, Baal would be, Lord.
So, why is Baal Lord?
It's from I think it's from the
Baal supposedly
because you will see, and I'm trying to think of some of the names of some of the kings and all that have Baal or some variation of that in their name. So it's like some of the kings claim deity, but just the idea of Lord. Let me find you something here in just a minute, hopefully. Yeah. Just a second there. I'm trying to get this one word called up here. Yeah. One thing here, Strong says that actually the root of it is master, which, would be the same thing with Lord as well. It's also translated Lord. But, you've got Baal, I think sometimes it appears as well. I'm trying to think, did you have a name of one of the kings or something that uses that? I think there's Baal Peor and some other names. Let me see if I can find one here. And I'm going through Balaam, Balak is another one. Balaam. Baal's in there, I think. Jerubbaal. How do you spell Jer?
I just thought like Baal was like an evil figure type.
Well, he is a false god, the Baal, and he became a false god, name for it. And I was trying to find the I'm looking up Jerubbaal, but I don't have the name spelled right. Jer. I didn't hear what was said back there.
Jerubbaal. Name for Gideon, Jerubbaal.
How do you spell it?
Jerubbaal, Judges 6:32.
Jeurba.
Bbaal.
Bbaal.
Jerubbaal. One word, Jerubbaal. Therefore, on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar."
All right.
When Gideon tore down the altar of Baal.
Is that 2 A's there? I can't hear.
Yes.
Okay.
That's in Judges 6.
All right. Yeah, I've got it. It's in several places. Judges 6, Judges 7, Judges 8. Yeah, and thank you for that, because when you look that up, the name there.
Covenant next to Baal, and somehow Baal could get knocked off the shelf. I think it's a different false god.
Yeah, I'm getting the
Dagon.
Dagon. Yeah. Jerubbaal is from Baal, Lord, and come on. Also the word for the to contend. Yeah, there's one thing I was looking for. Phoenician. Baal became the name of the Phoenician deity. That's the one I was looking for. I was trying to remember what it was. It's Phoenician deity. Baal and Balaam is plural. But when you look at the other part of Jerubbaal, or how you want to pronounce it, the first part there is to contend with somebody. And that's what Gideon did. Remember, he basically contended, fought against the false prophets. And so that's where the name was. It wasn't calling Gideon a god. It wasn't deifying him. In the same sense that the word Lord and gods is used in the scriptures, referring to people, you have like magistrates and government officials because they have power over people, power over their lives, even to the extent of taking their lives. We use, as I said before, we use the same derivations of Lord for somebody who owns your property and you rent it from your landlord, because he has sovereignty over the property. And then in the British courts, of course, they call the judges, they refer to them as my lord. And so there's that idea there. So yeah, so Baal would have been a name that came in from the Babylonians, or I'm sorry, the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians, to get an idea where the Phoenicians were, if you look on the map and see where Lebanon is today, that was where Phoenicia was. The Lebanese are actually descendants of the Phoenicians. In that sense, they're really not Arab. They get linked with the Arab peoples, but the Phoenician was a different group of people. And so they had a series of false gods, just like the Canaanites did, and they all did. And so Baal would have been derived, like I said, from the Phoenician deity, a god, but it's synonymous with a false god. But you will see it as a root or a part of compound names and words carrying in that idea of lordship or sovereignty or something.
The reason why I bring it up is because there's a huge debate that I keep seeing online is, you shouldn't call him Lord Jesus, like Lord is Baal, like, and you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
and I'm trying to figure it out, like, well, what's like Baal Jesus?
Well, exactly.
But did Baal get like it was a good word at one time and they hijacked it or something, or for their own deity?
Yeah, like I said, it appears that Baal came out of the Phoenician language. And remember, the Jews and the Phoenicians were very close during the reigns of King David and King Solomon, for instance. They were very close, and they employed a lot of Phoenician rock, or what do you want to call them, masons, basically. Not the Freemasons, but they were masons, stone masons, and they cut a lot of rock and everything. They also used them to bring a lot of timber and stuff down for work on the temple. Plus, they were renowned for their maritime skills. They had the ships of Phoenicia. And apparently what happened was the Jews and the Phoenicians during that 80-year period, with David and Solomon as kings, they were very close. They sailed all over the place. They were sailing, according to a number of things that I've read, they were not only sailing up to the British Isles. Remember when Jonah was told by the Lord to go to the Ninevites, and he said, I'm not going to go. And he went the opposite direction. And remember when he wound up, he fled, and I'm doing a brain freeze here. What was it? He fled to, Tarshish. There we go. I'm doing a brain freeze. I got Phoenicia on the mind and I couldn't get to Tarshish. Tarshish was a Jewish Phoenician outpost on the Atlantic coast of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. And it was a stop where they would go there. And then from there, they would go up the Atlantic coast of Europe, up into the British Isles. And then, of course, they mined tin there. And that tin mining actually was very important. Many hundreds of years later, Joseph of Arimathea, it's believed, was involved in the tin trade, which was why he was wealthy. And there's even a rumor that he took Jesus as a young man with him up to the British Isles where they had their mines. But going back to the time of David and Solomon and King was it King Hiram, I believe it was, in what was going on there in the Mediterranean world. They had copper, which is a relatively soft metal, but they didn't have much tin. Tin was an important strategic mineral because when you mix tin and copper together, you got what we today call bronze. But in the 1600s, when the King James was translated, they only had one word that was in use for copper alloys, and that was brass. So the word brass in the Bible, in the King James, is not a mistake. That was the word for any alloy of tin, or I'm sorry, of copper in the 1600s. And so bronze is just one type of alloy. Brass is another. Today we've distinguished between the two. But then brass was the word that was used. That's why you see it in the King James. And so it was, when you mix tin with copper, you got a very hard metal. A copper sword wouldn't last very long, would it? A few blows and it would be all dented to bits. But a bronze or a bronze sword would be pretty hard and it would last a lot longer. So it'd be a much superior weapon. So people closely guarded where they found tin. And the Phoenicians and the Jews had tin mines up in the British Isles at that time, and they brought them in. Interesting historical bit is when they came into the Mediterranean, they were instructed to tell people when they came into ports in the Mediterranean that they just barely survived sailing out of the Mediterranean, because when you sail out of the Mediterranean, it's dangerous. There's giant monsters in the sea, and there's this, that, and it was terrible. And yeah, but basically what happened was, excuse me, what happened was the Greeks and the Romans and different ones, well, the Greeks in particular, and the Media Persians and all that, they really didn't sail outside of the Mediterranean much. But the Jews and the Phoenicians did. They had ships that were going up into the British Isles, and we believe that they had ships that actually sailed all the way down along the coast of Africa and came up into where the Red Sea is, and then they would reverse the trip. And that trip took, I think it was 5 years or something, but it was a long trip because they'd make stops along the way. And when Christopher Columbus was engaging some Portuguese navigators to help him on his trip across the Atlantic to find a shorter path to the east, and that was largely because of the Islamic takeover, where they controlled and plundered the roadways through Asia, and so they were looking for this other path. Some of the Phoenicians were saying our forefathers routinely sailed to a land in the west, and their forefathers, some of them would have been Phoenicians and Jews, who apparently at that time were sailing to what we call the New World, the Americas. And there's evidence to indicate that at the time of Solomon, there was a transatlantic trade between the Americas and Solomon's kingdom. In Newark, Ohio, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. In Newark, Ohio, in one of the mounds that they found there, remember the mound builders? They're the original Native Americans. The Indians that call themselves Native Americans displaced these Native Americans so that they could call themselves Native Americans. That's why that name is kind of silly, because, I mean, we're Native Americans if you're born here, but the Indian tribes that we normally think of, Delaware, Wyandot, and Cheyenne, and Chippewa, and all them, they came along after the mound builders. The mound builders predate the time of Christ. And the mound builders, what they did was they had commerce that went from the upper peninsula of Michigan through the Great Lakes. They came down the Cuyahoga River from where Cleveland is, to right down here in the valley, the Cuyahoga Valley, and there's a place there's a road called Portage Trail, or I'm sorry, Portage Path. That's the older one. Portage Path goes over to Summit Lake, gets you to the Tuscaroras River, which goes down to what? The Maumee River, the Maumee River. And that takes you down to Ohio River, which takes you to the Mississippi, which takes you to Gulf of Mexico. You go to Moundsville, West Virginia, which is kind of an interesting place to visit. There's a museum there, and they found in Moundsville, they found copper that was mined in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in Moundsville, Virginia, and they've got seashells. West Virginia. What did I say?
Virginia.
Or Virginia. Well, at the time it was Virginia, but in West Virginia, and they've got seashells from the Gulf of Mexico there in Moundsville, West Virginia. This is all prior to the Native Americans claiming the title Native American. This is back, so getting back to Newark, Ohio, one of the mounds that was dug into, they found a little figurine. You can actually find it online, pictures of it online. It's not real big, a little stone box with like a figure of a man sort of, and it had some symbols around the outside edge. People couldn't read it, couldn't figure it out. Well, archaeologists later were discovering some of the ancient Hebrew text where the Hebrew language, the way the letters and all were written at the time of Solomon. And a guy who was familiar, who could read that, looked at this thing and he read it, and it's a condensed version of the Ten Commandments. Now, how did a stone carving with a condensed version of the Ten Commandments get into a mound that predates Christ in Newark, Ohio?
Okay.
Where would that have come from? in Hebrew of Solomon's day. And then also in Moundsville, they've got some little tablets there that's the same thing. They couldn't figure out the writing. A guy that understood the Hebrew writing of Solomon's day looked at it and he deciphered it. And it had some information and all, and made sense. So, of course, the archaeologists all said, oh, it's either a forgery or they made it up, the interpretation. Except that when you look at it in the ancient Hebrew, it's basically what it says. So that's why they go with it being a forgery, because obviously nobody came here before Christopher Columbus or maybe, Leif Erikson or something. But
So you think the Hebrews might have traveled across the Atlantic and brought it to the mound builders?
yeah, the Hebrews and the Phoenicians, I believe, had a trade across the Atlantic.
Okay.
They believe that a significant amount of copper left the New World. They don't know where it went. And Solomon was bringing, in addition to the copper mines in the Middle East, he was hauling in a bunch of copper, and they don't know where he was getting it from at the same time. Chris had something back there.
I just lost it.
All right. Yes.
I wonder if they dropped anything off at Oak Island.
Well, I don't know about that, if they went up that way, because I leave that one to the Vikings, but as they were out in that area.
That's the worst TV show ever made.
The Oak Island Mystery.
19 episodes, and the same guy finds something this big, 4,000 feet down. and goes,
Have you
Yeah.
found anything in there yet?
Half dozen rusty nails.
Yes.
Somebody years ago was saying, I got nothing better to do. I'll dig a big hole, put a bunch of stuff in it, and 100 years from now, people would be going crazy over it.
You think they had the whole
But-
island done
yeah.
by now?
Yes,
The curse of Oak Island.
yes.
I saw something online the other day that said, if you really want to mess with people a few hundred years into the future, if you catch a squirrel, bury it in a jewel-encrusted coat of armor in your backyard
There you go.
with a bunch of other, a bunch of like carved acorns and stuff. They'll think in 1,000 years, they'll think people, they're there to worship squirrel.
Instead, they were just nuts. Yes, Chris.
I remember, it's that Viking village that they found buried under the ice. That ice flow there in Greenland.
Yeah.
They
Well,
came
and
across it,
yeah.
So it's like under like 150 feet of
Yeah.
solid ice.
Well, and Greenland used to be largely ice-free. The Vikings raised oats there. They grazed cattle and sheep there. And then the medieval cooling period came in, the little ice age, and it drove them out because it got cold. But I was going to say, getting back to, yeah, but I was going to say, getting back to the thing. So there's evidence that suggests that the Jews and the Phoenicians were doing all of this. And so where we were getting at, and I want to get back to this other question here too. So because of the closeness of the Jews and the Phoenicians, some of the Phoenician language would have naturally come into the Jewish culture. And that happens a bit. Look at the closeness between the English and the French under some of the kings and queens, because some of them were not only kings of Great Britain, they were also kings of France at the same time. And they brought a lot of French into the English language. So where English was basically a Germanic language, it has a lot of the Latin and French and stuff influence in it. So
the Norman French were originally Danish Vikings.
yeah,
themselves.
yeah. So
The English were originally from Denmark too, as well.
yeah, some of them, and then you had the
Jews and
the Celtic peoples and the
Frisians
yeah.
and the Jews and the
Yeah.
Saxons, they were all originally
The,
from Denmark originally.
But when you look at over in Cornwall and Devonshire
Yeah.
and Wales
Yeah.
and Ireland and some of them actually have origins in the Iberian Peninsula, which means that some of them have yeah. So they had
They were Celtic.
yeah
The
Yeah.
ancestors of the English were originally from Denmark.
yeah, because you had the different groups that come together. So that's what I'm getting at. When you look at them, you might have some Phoenician and Jewish bloodlines into there. So at any rate, that's where you'll get Baal in there. I think it's an influence because of the Phoenician culture and things on the Jewish people. And so some of the words got in. But
Is
yeah.
Ice Age biblical, or is it always related to?
I think there was only one major ice age, and they try to tell you in school that the ice age, there was numerous ones because of the different layers and everything. But we know there's that documentary, you can watch it online, where a World War II bomber was parked on the ice. They had to land on the ice, and they came. Yeah, how long ago or how long later was it when they came? Was it 50 years later or something? And it was under like 100 feet of ice or something.
More ice than they.
Yeah, should have been thousands of years according to the way that ice supposedly formed. And the part of the problem is they do these ice cores and they're trying to say they're like tree rings where only one layer per year or maybe two layers per year, depending on how you look at it. But the reality is you could have a dozen layers in 1 year. And a lot of people don't realize, sometimes tree rings can actually have more than one ring per year on certain circumstances. So they don't usually tell you that. It's the same thing with when they do like they'll do a core sample going down the ocean floor or something, and they supposedly got these layers, and they tell you only one layer for so many period of years or whatever.
Right.
But they don't tell you sometimes you can get several layers in 1 year. One storm can give you several layers.
Do you think that the trees that grew before the flood had rings?
Yeah, obviously, because if they were vascular trees like oaks and apples and pine trees, they had rings because that's simply the way they grow. They couldn't have not had rings. Palm trees don't have the rings because they're vascular too. I shouldn't have said vascular ring trees, but they grow differently. They do, but yeah, the way it grows, it's a constant going out. Yeah. Oh, no, it's just the way they grow. Sometimes it can be warm and cold periods, and it's just different things. So, all right. Well, had a question here on a guy online, and let me go to the page where I found him, called the Cloud Church, and I had not heard of it, but the Cloud Church, missionary evangelist Robert Breaker. if anybody's seen that. And he looks like he's got some interesting stuff. He's King James only. He tends to follow Peter Ruckman on a number of things. And if you're not familiar with Peter Ruckman was in Pensacola, Florida. He was a very brilliant individual. I once heard somebody say that the two smartest people in terms of IQ that ever went to Bob Jones University were Peter Ruckman and Jack Van Impe. And so he is a very intelligent person. And one of the things he's most known for is his defense of the King James Bible. Now, some of his followers argue that the King James Bible corrects the originals, which I would have a problem with that, because God said that he would preserve his word. And if it took until English was developed to correct his word, I mean, what was going on in the meanwhile? So, but a lot of the stuff isn't so bad. I mean, I would disagree with some of Peter Ruckman's stuff, but we do that with a lot of people. And there's some things that you could do far worse than Peter Ruckman. I'm reminded of a pastor that when Kim and I were missionaries, we had a church in the Cincinnati area that supported us. And the pastor there, he went to, at the time, this would be back in the late 70s, early 80s. He went to Tennessee Temple in Tennessee. What town is it? Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he went to school there, Bible school there, and he was King James only. And he ran into some students that were telling him, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a Ruckmanite." And he said, he went through his Bible and he says, "I know about the Amorites and the Jebusites and the Girgasites." He said, "I couldn't find Ruckmanites." So he went to his Old Testament professor and he said, "These guys called me a Ruckmanite." And I said, "I've been going through the concordance, going through the Bible, trying to find the Ruckmanites. I know about the," and he went through that. He said his professor started laughing. He said, "No, it's not in the Bible. They're called Peter Ruckman, who's pastoring down in Pensacola." And so he kind of became synonymous with that early on. Those of you that knew Bruce Musselman, he knew Peter Ruckman. And so this guy here, Robert Breaker, apparently, came out of his, I haven't read everything here, but apparently came out of his church or something. Yeah. And so he has this video site basically, or the Cloud Church, where he says, "Welcome to the Cloud Church, an online meeting place for Bible believers to study the Bible on the cloud, the internet." And this site focuses on reaching shut-ins, the sick, the elderly, prisoners, those who cannot travel, those without a local church home, and or those who just can't find good old-fashioned Bible preaching and teaching anywhere nowadays. And so he's got a lot of teaching videos and things like that. And just scanning through it, everything looks pretty good. And so question was, there's this thing that he has a chart that he's got. Now, did you say it's a work in progress that he's working on, or?
No, he has a million charts. That's just
Okay, just
the
one
way
of them.
that-
Yeah.
that chapter.
This is where we'll have to get our boards up here that we can draw on, because this would be a good one to draw on. But he talks about 4 rests. And the first rest is easy to see. Go to Genesis chapter number 2. Genesis chapter number 2 and verse number 1. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." To reference chapter 1, where they had the 6 days of the creation week. And so now those things have taken place. He said that, and then he says in verse 2, "And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." So he has on his chart here, you can all see that back there, right? There you go. There, right back there. There we go. Everybody see it close. Yeah, but he calls it the creation rest. And we understand he stopped doing the creative work and all that. The completion of creation was complete. That didn't mean that God took a back seat and no longer doing anything at all. But he says that he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. God wasn't tired out. This makes an implication to some people. God wasn't like we are. He wasn't worked 6 days hard and now he's tired. He's got to take a nap. That's not the case. But he established a precedence for us, working 6 days, spending a day, letting the body recuperate a little bit, and also spending some time with the Lord. So the creation rest, and that would be the first one. The next one would be after they wandered, the Jewish people were in Egypt, and then they were out and they wandered in the wilderness, and then they went into the promised land finally, and that would be the Canaan rest, because that was the land of Canaan. And now, of course, and like Marty pointed out, God didn't really rest as in not doing anything. When the Jews went into the promised land, they didn't just stop doing anything. They did a lot. But he called that the Canaan rest. And then, of course, we have what he calls the believer that you drew out here. Was he talking about the age of grace, or was he talking about when we're caught up to heaven?
I think he was talking about the age of grace.
Okay, I would not agree with that part of it. I would think the believer's rest is when we're caught up to heaven. We have a time to work, pray for laborers because the harvest, the fields are white unto harvest. We're to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. This is a call to work. Yeah. Yeah. And so this is a call to work, and we work until we're caught up to be with the Lord in heaven. And so I would say that's where the believer's rest is. The rest is not here. We have a sad case, and I've actually encountered over the years pastors that have done this. Pastored faithfully for 30 years, 40 years, and then they retire and do nothing. I'm not saying going from actively pastoring to doing something else. I know one pastor, in fact, I just talked to him recently, pastored for many years, and now he's retired, but he does pulpit supply. And there's a number of pastors that do that. There's a number of pastors that retire from being a pastor of a church, and perhaps they go somewhere where they teach in a Bible school or something, or perhaps they become an evangelist. There's any number of things that can be done. And you'll see the same thing, people who spend a long time as a layperson working in the church, then they retire, and they retire on the church as well. As long as there's breath in our body, we can do something. And Brian Starr used to talk about a lady who was basically bedbound, and all she could about do was move her hand, and people would give her paper, and she would write out notes of encouragement to people. That was her ministry. Write a note of encouragement to a pastor, to a missionary, to a Sunday school teacher, to a church member somewhere. And God blessed her ministry. That's all she could do. I had somebody tell me one time, you go down to Florida, you find all these retired deacons and pastors and church members that are doing nothing. Teach a Sunday. There's something you can do. Teach a Sunday school class, something. You don't have to be active in the ministry. And I don't know. Unless I was somehow prevented from doing what I'm doing now, I don't know why I would stop. It's like some people think when you reach a certain age, you shouldn't do anything anymore.
What did they do for Tuesday and Wednesday and Monday and Thursday? Did they teach that holy too?
I don't know what they did. They just, yes.
7th day holy?
Yeah. So they just,
keep every day
yeah,
holy.
exactly.
If we're not, that means we're sinning every day of the week.
Yeah. So the believer's rest, I would argue, is when we hear that trumpet sound and we're caught up to be with the Lord in heaven, and we're going to meet with him there. We'll have the judgment seat of Christ, in the Bema seat, will be awarded based on their faithfulness of service. And we're going into a period of rest.
Right.
Then we're going to come back at the end of the tribulation to the earth with the Lord, and he's going to set up a millennial reign here on earth. And this he calls the millennial rest, where the world, the earth, essentially will rest because of all the turmoil that's going on now and all the turmoil that'll go on during the tribulation, where Jesus basically said if it goes on any longer, there wouldn't be anything left. And so all that turmoil, the earth rests during that period of time. It's like a number of people looked at it and said, you know, they believe it'll be the 7,000th year, so to speak. We had 6,000 years of human history, and now we come to 7, and that would be the millennium, 7,000 years, and it'd be like a rest, you know, 6,000 being like 6 days, and the 7,000 being like the day of rest. So I would agree with the Canaan or the creation rest, the Canaan rest, the millennial, or I'm sorry, the Canaan rest, the believers rest. I think is when we get caught up to be in heaven, and then the millennial rest, you know, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so with that, I would agree with much of this. So what I've been scanning over this a little bit too while we were getting set up here. And much of his stuff looks pretty good. And like I said, I haven't. Well, I haven't seen that. But one thing that you do have to watch out, though, when you get with people who follow Ruckman closely, Ruckman has some odd teachings, to say the least. I know this because I've seen some of Ruckman's books. Friend of ours who pastors in Delaware, before he was pastor, Tim and I used to see him a lot because he was living in Maryland, and we used to pass through and see him a lot when we were going through. Spent a lot of time with him, and he asked me about a book one time that he got by Peter Ruckman, and Peter Ruckman taught a false doctrine that the world is divided, or mankind is divided into the white race, the yellow race, and the black race. And I think we've talked about this, touched on this before. The white race being the sons of Japheth, the black race being the sons of Ham, and the yellow race being the sons of Shem. Well, the unfortunate part of that is that in the descendant, the Solomon Islanders, of which we saw some when we were in the South Pacific, the Solomon Islanders are a Semitic people, which means they're descendants ultimately of Shem. And they are about this color. They are the darkest skinned people I've ever seen. They're not related to the Africans. They're a Semitic people. And
Is there a line Semitic?
Yeah, it's a Semitic line that goes that
Like
way.
Hebrew?
Well, descendants of Abraham, of Shem, not necessarily Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
The Hebrews and the Arabs are Semitic peoples,
Yeah.
and the Chinese and the Koreans and all. Chris has got something in a minute in the back, but I was going to say the Indians of India, okay? And you get many of them. I don't have anything with the color on it, I guess, but you get some fairly dark-skinned Indian people. They're a Japhetic people. They're of the line of Japheth. And yet you got some very dark-skinned people in the line of Japheth. Not all of the line of Ham is dark-colored. Some are light-colored. Like I said, there's about every skin color type in the descendants of Ham, in the descendants of Shem, and in the descendants of Japheth. But Peter Ruckman taught that all of the dark-skinned people are the descendants of Ham. All of the brown-skinned people, which he called yellow, are the descendants of Shem, and all of the light-skinned are the descendants of Japheth. And then he goes on to teach that God divided them. Europe was created for the descendants of Japheth, Asia for the descendants of Shem, and Africa for the descendants of Ham. and they were put on separate continents to keep them separate. Therefore, never should the races mix. So he would have been against a mixed racial marriage. When we use the
He
term
was.
race, it's not really a good term because there's only one race, the human race. White, black, brown, anything, any mixture or variation on that are all part of the human race. We're just different variations of human beings in terms of skin color. And the unfortunate thing is some of the Ruckmanites are very much against any kind of mixed racial type background. One of the things that I've noticed, and of course today, mixed, and I know what we mean when we say the term mixed race, so I use that for convention. But today, the idea of mixed races is not usually looked at the same way it was 50 years ago. But even 50 years ago, it's interesting that people would accept Asian and European mixed marriages more than European and African. But if races weren't to mix, and you go by Ruckman's theory of the white European, the yellow Asian, and the black African, and they shouldn't mix, then a European married to a Japanese would be just as bad as married to a Nigerian. But yet the Japanese or Korean or Chinese spouse was usually not looked down as poorly as the African spouse. That gets to just basically gets to bigotry and prejudice. But the point of the matter is, Ruckman was wrong on that. It doesn't work biologically, it doesn't work biblically, but he taught it, and a lot of people believe it. Some people who follow that even go to the extent that everybody was basically one color until the Tower of Babel, and God created the different races there, which is a problem. And go ahead.
So, in the Bible, doesn't God try to keep the Hebrews from like intermingling with different people?
With people who were of a pagan background? That was more the concern, because yeah,
They blamed him for the
yeah.
plagues, and they
Yeah.
blamed the
Yeah.
plagues.
but Moses had was it an Ethiopian wife? I think it was, who was black. And over in the
And Ruth and Boaz.
Ruth was a Moabitess, and there were some restrictions on if somebody from one of these certain racial group, or I should say racial, how long they would be before they would be recognized as Jewish in terms of ethnicity, because they would have children and all that, like obviously Ruth did. But the prohibition was more on the men than it was on the women, because Ruth married Boaz, and then they had David's father. But what I was going to say too, in Song of Solomon, if you go over there to the start of the Song of Solomon, it says in Song of Solomon, and let's see. I'm trying to find the word out there. Yeah. No wonder I can't find it. I'm in the wrong book. I thought it was in Song of Solomon, and I wound up in Ecclesiastes. And I'm looking at chapter 1 thinking, I don't see what I want. I know it's in chapter 1. Yeah, I'm thinking, wait a minute, it's got the rivers flowing and all that. I'm in the wrong book. That's why you have to have a Bible with you, because sometimes I turn to the wrong thing. All right, Song of Solomon, chapter 1. Now I'm in Song of Solomon, not Ecclesiastes. Song of Solomon, chapter 1. And there's an interesting statement here. It says in verse 5, the person that's talking here says, I am black, but comely. O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept. Now, let me pause here for a moment and go to something that seems at first kind of unrelated. Anybody familiar with Nation of Islam? Nation of Islam teaches Louis Farrakhan and who was his predecessor? Malcolm X, I think it was. But anyway, you get this idea in the Nation of Islam and some other groups. The British Israelites, I think, champion this mostly now. But the idea that Jesus was black, not brown, but black. We know one thing: he wasn't white. He was probably brown because he would have looked like a typical Jewish person of his day. But they say he was black, not just dark skinned, but of African origin. With dreadlocks, yes. Yeah, you're right, because you see the pictures. Here's where they prove that he was black, okay? He was black because he's the descendant of Solomon, and Solomon said, he's a descendant of David, I'm sorry. He's a son of David, and Solomon's son David said, I am black but comely. Anybody see a problem with that yet? It's not Solomon saying that, is it? It's some woman that's saying that, who Solomon is in a relationship with. And when it says, I'm black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon, when you look into this, this person is not of African origin. It's probably more like Bedouin, Arab. What happens if you take somebody, yes, if you take somebody who has a medium brown skin? Well, let's take it this way first. Somebody who has light skin like most of us, and you put them out in the field in the middle of the summer to work, like when it's making hay, you know, what happens? Your skin gets what? Darker. You take somebody who has a brown skin, you put them out in the sun to work, and their skin gets darker. Even black people's skin gets darker because the amount of melanin begins to concentrate in your skin and to protect your skin against the ultraviolet light. It's just that some people have more concentrations naturally, and some people can develop a deeper concentration. I had a friend in college who was, his ancestry was part Dutch and part American Indian. I forget which tribe it was. And in the wintertime, he would be very pale. In the summertime, once he was out in the sun for a while, he could pass very much as a brown skinned person. His skin would get almost a mahogany brown color. That's the variation that he had. Well, what she says here, you can see that this is what's being talked about, because look at verse 6. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun, why? Because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards. What did they do to her? They made her work out in the hot sun while they did what? They worked inside under a tent, under an awning. There's a reason that lighter skin was favored amongst darker skinned people and amongst even lighter skinned people, because if you had to work outside manual labor, you would get darker. If you did not have to stoop to manual labor, meaning you were wealthy, you could stay inside out of the sun, you would have lighter skin than everybody else. And by having lighter skin, it advertised, I'm a person of means. I'm a person of wealth. I'm not like you because I don't have a suntan, because I don't have to be out in the sun like you do. It's only since about the mid 20th century that lighter skinned people started getting this fixation. I want to be tan. I want to tan. I want darker skin. Lighter skin was almost universally always a symbol of wealth and prosperity and privilege and power. When I say privilege, I'm not talking about the woke privilege here, but it was a symbol of that, because look at right here, it's biblical. She said, don't look down on me, don't condemn me, don't judge me because I have to work out in the hot sun. My mother's children, and I think that implies that perhaps there's a blended family sort of thing here, that her mother has other children, perhaps by another husband, but whatever the case is, they don't like her, they're angry with her, and they made her work out in the hot sun while they stayed out of the sun. So the black there doesn't mean that she was African. The black there simply means she had darker skin than some of the others. And don't look down on me because of it, because I was forced to work out here in the field.
The elite, that's how the Egyptians started with makeup,
Mm-hmm.
to cover the skin so
Yeah. Look lighter.
to keep it from getting black.
Yeah. And also people would put powder on so they would look
Yeah, they
whiter than
burn-
they
burn
were.
otherwise.
But even people would put powder on to look whiter. So they looked more
Yeah, you
prosperous.
burn either way.
They look more prosperous. And so it was just a vanity thing. So now you want to look darker so that you look prosperous, because in the wintertime, they invented tanning salons so that poorer people could look like they had money to fly to Florida for the winter. So, any rate, Chris, that's a
They
big.
had that, there was a tribe, there was in, what was it, French Morocco or North Africa during World War II they could trace their bloodlines back to, the Queen of Sheba.
Yeah, I think some of them in Ethiopia probably can too, because
And let's see, when France surrendered, I think this was they covered this on the History Channel for the Holocaust. The Nazis rounded them all up, and literally there was probably about 40,000 of them.
mm-hmm.
And when all was said and done, they had in the Nuremberg trials, actually, they brought that up, and there was like about 75 people left in that tribe of 70, 80,000.
Yeah.
And they just pointed them out and said, that's why.
Yeah. Well, and part of that was because Hitler, totally believing the Darwinian theory of evolution,
Yeah.
was convinced that the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan was the peak of evolutionary development. That's why he used the term the master race, because they were at the peak. Everybody else was less developed. And if you look at pictures, we ever see those pictures of supposedly the evolution of man, starting with some kind of ape-like creature on his knuckles to finally modern man. If you notice, a lot of those pictures, they start out with darker skin, and as they become more modern, the skin tone lightens. And, you had Aborigines in Australia who are, if I'm correct, I believe they are a Semitic people. They're not African, and they're very dark skinned. But Aborigines were actually in the, early days of Australia hunted and exterminated because they did not believe they were human beings. They did not believe. Some missionaries would argue, should we try to evangelize them? And others would argue, well, they're not human. They don't have a soul to be saved. Aborigines. They actually had some Aborigines in zoos as a primitive form of man. The Bronx Zoo in New York City in the 1800s. There was a guy from the Pygmy tribe in Africa that his job was to go sit in a cage at the Bronx Zoo all day as a form of early man. Then at the end of the day, at least he got to go home. But they actually displayed various types of black people, whether Aborigines, Australia, or the Negroid peoples of Africa, or some other group. They actually had them on display in zoos around the world. They were in the London Zoo. They were in other European zoos. They had, and people thought nothing of it when the Darwinian theory got advanced and began to take hold on people in the late 1800s. They did this because they, evolution, they're subhuman. They're not really people. They're just advanced animals. We can put an orangutan, we can put a chimpanzee, we can put a gorilla, and next to them an aborigine. And they're, in their mind, they were all animals. Yes.
That's also what made eugenicists like H.G. Wells and Margaret Sanger
Mm-hmm.
say that, well, if only the white people are the most evolved, then
Mm-hmm.
the less developed races shouldn't be permitted to reproduce. What's the point? Just let them,
Yes.
live, worthless lives of
Yeah.
pleasure and vanity, but try to discourage their reproduction.
Mhm.
That's why Sanger founded Planet.
Yes. And she called brown.
Human weeds.
But I was going to say, she called brown and dark-skinned people human weeds. And even today, where do you find the large Planned Parenthood centers? What part of town?
Black neighborhood.
They're in the black neighborhoods predominantly. If somebody is a black person, how they can be enthused with Planned Parenthood is beyond me. There's a young woman that's running. She wants to be state senator, and she's running on the Democrat ticket. And she's up, I've seen some of her TV ads. She's proud of how pro-choice she is. If she understood where the pro-choice position come from, she would renounce it immediately, because Margaret Sanger and the founders of Planned Parenthood wanted to exterminate black people because they thought they were inferior. How can a black woman stand up and say, vote for me because I believe that? Because that's what she's saying.
Full human, they're
Right.
98, where is that written?
It's not in the Bible, and that comes from
No,
evolution.
Right on paper.
Well, in
Not-
that,
Not the Constitution. I don't know.
oh no, you're talking about in the Constitution, the 2/3 thing.
Right.
That was the 2/3 compromise. It's not recognizing whether or not they're part human or not. What Marty's talking about in the Constitution, in order to get the Constitution
Yeah, that's
passed,
right.
in order to get the Constitution passed, you had the northern states, especially the smaller states in the north, and then you had the southern states, which had the slave-based economy. And in order to get the Constitution passed, they made a compromise because the slave states wanted to count the slaves as part of the population for representation in Congress. And even though they weren't allowed to vote, the northern states were saying, well, you don't let them vote. How can you count them as part of your population? You're not even recognizing them as free free citizens. And so the compromise was, but what this was in revisionist history, they're trying to tell people in school now that this was to say that the blacks were less than human. The reason it's there is to recognize they are human beings and they do deserve representation, but because you won't recognize them as human, as free citizens, how can you see what I'm saying? I know I'm not explaining that fully, but basically the idea that they included them in there, but they forced the South to
Zero representation versus 66% representation.
Yeah, but they forced the South to recognize that these are human beings that deserve recognition. And it also kind of forced the thing that slavery is not a good thing, because many of the people who signed that and promoted that were people who were against slavery. Here, give us some thought here too, as the thinking of the day. The same time the United States Constitution was being written in Philadelphia, which is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, all, the Northwest Ordinance was being written. And the key to getting the Northwest Ordinance written was that the Northwest territories would be free, no slavery at all. So for people who think the Constitution was written to protect slavery, they don't know what they're talking about. there was such a controversial issue at the time. In order to get the Constitution passed with the recognition that eventually, now that you're recognizing these blacks as slaves as human beings, they're going to be full citizens eventually. That was the thinking. And you can see the desire to eliminate slavery by the insistence that the Northwest Territories be slave free. And so that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand. So, like I said, two documents being written at about the same time. And so we got that. Even a lot of the people in the South that where slavery was there recognized it wasn't going to last forever. They understood it. And, you know, we can say what we want about slavery and all that, but the fact is, the founding fathers were not trying to say blacks were not human and not deserving of rights. They were trying to elevate them at the time. Yes.
Many of the founding fathers, they didn't like slavery, but they didn't know, they didn't think you could just up and free a bunch of people who had known nothing but, you know, after
Yeah.
They didn't know how to get rid of it.
Thomas Jefferson said slavery is, you know, the slavery in the United States at the time was like holding a dog by its ears. It's not pleasant. You shouldn't have got into the situation, but you're afraid to let it go.
Because the dog's going to bite you. But you bring up another good point too. There were a number of these people who had slaves. In some cases, they inherited them, and they didn't want to let them go because the only way you could let them go was to sell them under the laws of the day. So they retained them as slaves so that they could protect them. They say, "Oh, how could they protect? How could they think that?" Well, when you look at what was going on, you know, the idea they were property, and if you couldn't just let them go.
And if you gave a writing, all they do is burn that writing. up.
Yeah, and then
And
somebody
that
would
would
take
be-
them.
Who would recognize them?
So
Yeah.
some of these people kept them in order to protect them.
Right.
That happened.
It's-
George Washington did
Yeah.
that.
And
Jefferson did
yeah,
that.
and of course the other thing too, a lot of people don't realize is that slavery in this country, it wasn't just whites enslaving blacks. Whites enslaved blacks, they enslaved Indians, they enslaved whites. Indians enslaved blacks, they enslaved Indians, they enslaved whites.
They still
Blacks-
are today, all
Yeah,
around.
blacks in this country enslaved blacks, whites, and Indians. Everybody enslaved everybody. Slavery's been a part of human history. It was the Christian countries that eliminated slavery. Question, is there more slavery in the world today than there was in the early 1800s?
Yes.
Absolutely more. There are more black slaves in the world today than there ever was prior to the Civil War. And you know where most of them are? In the Muslim countries. The Muslim countries have for centuries been the main organizers of and promoters of slavery in the world. The Americans didn't come along. They came along. Everybody else was enslaving people left and right. The word slave comes from the Muslims in the Middle East raiding the Slavic peoples in Europe. What color were they? Were they black or white? They were white. They enslaved them. They brought them down into the Middle East and Northern Africa, and they sold them in the markets by such great numbers that Slav became the root of slave. Slave was literally the Slavs. That became the word slave. People don't realize slavery got its name because so many white people were enslaved by the Muslims.
Right, we got slave village right next to Newburgh Heights.
Yeah,
They call it the Slavic village.
yeah, exactly. And how about any Marines in here? What's in the Marine hymn? From the halls of what to the what? Exactly. And why is that there? Because Thomas Jefferson said, we are not going to put up with the Muslims there on the Barbary Coast capturing American ships and enslaving Americans. And he did what? He sent in the Marines, didn't he?
Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute.
Exactly.
For ransom.
Because you know what was going on in Europe at that time? Muslim slave traders would raid the coasts of Europe all the way up into the British Isles. They would come, they would see people on the coast, they'd send a boat ashore, they'd grab as many people as they could, load them onto the boat, take them out there. Anybody ever heard of a song called Amazing Grace by chance?
Yeah.
Yeah. The writer of that, he was a slave, he was worked on a slave ship. He was thrown off the ship and he was sold as a slave in northern Africa. He was a slave himself at one time, and then he escaped, and then he got saved. And how about an individual by the name of Patrick of Ireland? He was a slave in Ireland. The Irish enslaved some of the English and Scots. They would send a party over and grab them and enslave them. He got saved and he went back and he evangelized the people who had been enslaving him and his people. But yeah, so slavery's always been there. You see it in the Bible as well. But what I was going to say is that the Constitution was actually in its day a remarkable piece of writing that said these people are human beings that deserve rights. And it laid the groundwork for the eventual demise of slavery. And then, of course, the Northwest Ordinance at the same time banned slavery there because they had the ability to do it. Chris is going to see that back there.
Over there on Copley Road, your White Pond,
Mm-hmm.
where that infamous Indian battle was. Erie Island.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That was because they did not want to join the Iroquois Confederacy that
Mhm.
committed slavery.
And the Iroquois Confederacy, which was usually considered as one of the more civilized groups of American Indians, they practiced slavery.
And when
They enslaved Indians, whites, and blacks alike.
they showed up at
Yeah.
the land that Arnold didn't like. but they
Yeah.
were having a field day there.
Mm-hmm. All right. We had another question. Yeah, you had a question.
Yes,
Sure.
in Genesis,
Mhm.
the curse that God placed on Ham, does that have anything to do with any of this?
A lot of people try to say that the curse in Genesis, and you're thinking there in chapter, what, about 9 or so, I think? Yeah. Genesis chapter 9, when Noah had planted a vineyard and then he made some wine, which it became fermented, and he drank a bunch of it. He was drunken, says in verse 21. This is Genesis chapter 9, verse 21. Actually, the sentence starts in verse 20, so we'll go there. And Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and was drunken. He was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it laid upon both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah woke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be, and God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And there's various reasons that people speculate as to why Noah made this prophetic curse on Ham's son rather than Ham himself. But the curse itself, some people said, well, he was cursed with dark skin, with black skin, that would warrant that, except that people want black skin to look like some kind of, you're less favored of God. A lot of that came in when people were looking at,
The Darwin.
the Darwinist theories, that the blacks were less advanced.
God had slaves anyway, but that was a whole different system.
Yeah, but looking at this idea of this cursing here, some people have even gone back and said the mark that was on Cain back in before the flood was dark skin as well. And but there's nothing that warrants that either. When we look at this, the idea, I believe, is that the disappointment that Noah felt in his son Ham, he wanted his son Ham to feel in his son. So Canaan might have been like one of his favorite sons or whatever. And so by cursing Canaan, he caused great disappointment for the father, Ham. And as a consequence, Canaan was to be a servant of servants. And so then people would say, well, then he must have been black because that's why the blacks were slaves. But whites were slaves, Indians were slaves, brown-skinned people were slaves, white-skinned people were slaves, black-skinned people were slaves. Slaves came in all colors and nationalities. And so this was basically to make Ham feel disappointment like Noah felt in his son. I think he wanted Ham to feel disappointment
So it's
in
limited,
his
not
son.
generational. It's limited to Cain.
Well, but the descendants of Canaan and his descendants, servants, and so yeah, the enlarging Japheth, meaning he would enlarge his land and his, his realm of authority and all that, and yeah, so this is basically a prophetic statement. You'll see in especially prior to Moses, the times of the patriarchs, a patriarchal blessing on their descendants, and it has a prophetic application to their descendants. It's not just that person, but it's their descendants. So remember, there's not very many people in the earth right now.
This is Noah placing a curse, not God placing a curse.
No, but you see this in some of the things, and sometimes it's not that God is. I'm trying to see how I want to phrase this. We understand God is sovereign. We also understand God is outside of time. God knows what the future is going to be when this is taking place at the time of Noah, and God knows what his descendants are going to be like already. So God can influence, Noah or later on some of the other patriarchs to make statements over their children that are going to come true because God already knows that they're going to come true. It doesn't mean God's making it come true. It just means that he knows that that's what's going to happen. It was the same case with Jacob and Esau. It wasn't that Jacob and Esau was so much can cause that prophetically to be said by the patriarch because he's acting as, in a sense, the priest over the family. So it wasn't that God was necessarily cursing the descendants of Ham or the descendants of Canaan. It's just that he knew what was going to happen. And but also Noah was upset, like Neil pointed out. And Noah was wanting his son Ham to feel disappointment because he felt disappointment in his son. So, but God has an amazing way of tying these things together. Yes.
Didn't the Canaanites become servants to the Israelites?
Yeah,
So in a way that
yeah.
was a fulfilled prophecy.
Yeah, and in fact, the land of Canaan, notice what it says, he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Well, the tents of Shem, the Jewish people were descendants of Shem, and God gave the land of Canaan to them, didn't he? So the remainder of the Canaanites in the land, where did they dwell? They dwelt in the tents of Shem.
That the Canaanites is part of the Italians are part of the Canaanites.
Yeah, but
All the way north of Rome, they're from the other.
yeah, and some of them moved up in that area. But when we look at the promised land, that was the land of Canaan.
Right. They were
And
dark.
God gave the land of Canaan, the promised land, to the Jewish people. And so the Canaanites that remained in the land, they did exactly what was here. They dwelt in the tents of Shem because they dwelt
They
there
were
where
dark.
the
Because
Israelites were.
of the sin of the people.
Well, that was, remember, Israel did not displace all of them at once. God said that he wanted to be progressive going in because he didn't want the land to go wild. He wanted them to push them out, but they were supposed to, in most cases, to destroy everything because God was passing judgment on the Canaanites because the Canaanites, remember the human sacrifice that they performed and just the wickedness that they were involved in. and the immorality that they were involved in. In fact, one of the things that he rebukes Israel for later on, he says, you've become worse than the Canaanites. And that's saying something when he said that. And so as a consequence, God used Israel as a tool of judgment against the Canaanites. And then some Canaanites, of course, did last, because remember the one city where they heard what Joshua was doing when he was conquering all these places, and they said, man, he's going to come and destroy us any day. Let's do this. They put on old clothes, and they had bread and wine that was going sour, and they pretended that they'd traveled for weeks, a long time, and they come to them and they sue for peace. We've come a long way. Look, our bread's molded on the way. The wine's turned sour. Our clothes are falling apart. And they fooled them. And then I was going to say, and then they said, time later, they come over the hill and there they are, right there's their city. They say, wait a minute, but we already made a deal. So they became hewers of wood and haulers of water because they had already made a deal with them. But it also became kind of a thorn in their side, didn't it? So it really is kind of interesting. They weren't unintelligent people. They had it was a pretty smart thing on their part.
Right. When I went to Egypt, and of course I was in Israel there for a feast of tabernacles for a week. And then I went to some of those other places around there. When I started eating the bread, it tastes just like Italian bread, because the Italians did come out of Canaan, the lower part of them. And of course, they went also to Africa, right over the rock of over there. And you're in the black again.
Yeah.
But if that's just by that bread, if there's a certain taste, my grandmother makes the bread to this, well, she's dead now. But the Italian bread they make here does not taste like the Italian
bread
that they make it.
Well, and you look at the way the peoples migrated, you can see some of this reflected in language, culture, and part of culture is food.
And
You'll see that.
and I found out all kinds of
So
things.
it's kind of amazing when you look at this. But yes, I think that's part of where we're going. Yes.
Did you hear about this tablet they found in Israel? This ancient.
Which one?
The iron tablet or something?
Because they found a couple
First
of them.
tablet?
There was one that I think I was looking at back in January, February. I think that
They just found something too, just
Dates back to like
David.
1500 BC. And it's
More
like the
writings?
oldest written text.
Yeah.
With Yahweh written on it. Talking about Yahweh.
In fact, they're finding a lot of that stuff now.
Well, and it's amazing, whenever they dig into this stuff,
The Bible is-
it shows the Bible exists.
Isaiah is almost identical to
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
the revised standard, not the revised.
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you look at the Textus Receptus,
Right.
there's some of that, or not Textus Receptus, Hebrew Masoretic text, because it's Old Testament, is it Isaiah and all that. And when you read the English translation of some of the Isaiah scrolls, it reads a lot like the King James Bible.
Not a lot, almost. It's almost exactly.
So it's pretty
I saw the
amazing.
ones that
Yeah.
were in there when I
But
was
this
in
one you're talking about goes back to what, 1500 BC?
It's like the oldest. They just came out with it like
Mhm.
in March.
Yeah, and they find these periodically. This is something that the Muslims are trying to destroy before people find these. So you wonder how many things have been destroyed over the years, because the Muslims are trying to destroy all evidence of the Jewish occupation of the land, 1,000 years ago, hundreds of years ago. In fact, up until Israel became a nation, the Muslims used to give tours of the Temple Mount and say, this is where King David came. This is where King Solomon came. And they talked all about the Jewish history of the Temple Mount. They had booklets and things that you could get if you went there that talked about the Jewish history of the Temple Mount. When Israel became a state in 1948, all of that started to change. And now today, they're the same people that prior to that were saying, here's the Jewish history of the Temple Mount. Now say, oh, the Jews were never here. Ignore all of that evidence of them. And they are actively digging on the Temple Mount because Israel allows Jordan to control the Temple Mount. They can't stop them from digging. But what they do is they go through the debris that is dumped and they find a lot of things in there. But you wonder how many more things the Muslims have found and destroyed
They still
from
think
digging
that
there.
they're-
Yeah.
They didn't build that right over the original. place.
So more things, I think, as we get closer to the end, I think God's going to allow more things to surface and be found.
We were talking about on your show this afternoon.
Hmm. The
Psalm 83.
the Psalm 83 battle.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's part of it because in Psalm 83 they want the name of Israel to not be remembered anymore.
And there's a lot of terrorism going on over there.
Oh, yeah,
Deep.
If you didn't hear the program today, I was mentioning because we had a question come up, our caller, about some things in Daniel. But right now, in fact, I heard it on the news just a little earlier this evening. There's a huge increase in terrorist attacks in Israel. You're not hearing about it because all you hear about is Russia and Ukraine. It dominates the news. It's Ramadan is part of it, but there's more to it than Ramadan. In fact, there's a site online called the Religion of Peace. I think it's religionofpeace.com. And it's a site devoted to exposing Islam. And in Ramadan, they do the Ramadan Bombathon. It's the countdown of all the terrorist activities that take place. Kim's going to look it up there, but I just like the name Ramadan Bombathon because there's always an uptick in terrorist activity during Ramadan. It's Ramadan right now. Ramadan varies throughout the calendar when it's going to be. This year, it coincides with Passover and it coincides with Easter and all of that. So it's really a strong uptick there right now in terror activity.
And they're trying to
But-
name Syria. It really belongs that's
The Golan Heights.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
So you
you're
can
seeing
see
it.
it
Yeah.
getting ready for the battle.
But here's the thing that's not as widely known outside of the Arab world, or I should say the Muslim world, because it's not just Arab. One of the best-selling books in Malaysia over the last few years deals with this subject. The idea is that this Muslim cleric back in the 1990s, I believe it was, came up with this prophecy, calculation, whatever you want to call it, based on things in the Quran, based on other things, that claims that Israel will cease to exist in June of 2022. Now, this has been going on in the Muslim world for a number of years now. One of the reasons that the terror activity is so big right now, such that the prime minister of Israel actually said all Israelis that should be carrying weapons in public. Everybody's to be armed. This idea that the Arab world, the Muslim world, I should say, has that Israel is going to cease to exist in about 2 months. This is early April. So April, May, June, that's 2 months. One date that I saw is they said that they think that by June 9th, this will happen. A seminar one time, there used to be a group in the Cleveland area called Cops for Christ, and they brought this guy in that he was based out of Columbus, but he worked all over the United States dealing with occult-related crime. And so Cops for Christ had him in, and he was talking about how to understand crime scenes as to whether it's just something, some kind of a nutcase versus some kind of, and he was talking about the different thing, but he made a statement in regards to this because They opened it up. They had some people coming in, pastors, and they had some police coming in and all that. And so he made a statement. He said, it doesn't matter whether or not you believe these things. What matters is that they believe them. And that's the same point with this. Israel will cease to exist by June of 2022. We can say, well, that's ridiculous. We read the Bible, we know that's not going to happen. It doesn't matter whether we believe that or not. Millions of Muslims believe that. And if they believe that, what are they going to do? At the same time, and Marty had brought this up, you've got the deputy ambassador from Russia to the UN in the Security Council back in February saying Israel is illegally occupying the Golan Heights. They need to leave. You had just this past week, the UN Human Rights Commission issue a condemnation of Israel saying they're illegally occupying the Golan Heights. They need to leave. You've got Syrian and Iranian forces building up on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. You've got Russia building up forces in Syria. Their largest naval base outside of Russia is the Syrian port. And they've got a huge Air Force base there that they're putting bombers and fighter jets and personnel there. People have said it almost looks like he's got his second string up in Ukraine, maybe because he's got a bunch of them down in Syria right now. So what's he doing in Syria? And all this stuff setting the stage, maybe they've got plans for something.
They
Yes.
have people on the television, on this, the star
TV,
on it,
yeah.
the Daily Star. Anyway, the Israel is knocking down every missile they send there,
Mhm.
but they've been upping it up. They keep up.
Right.
And they're at the point where no matter how fast they shoot them down,
Mhm.
they'll not.
They won't get them all.
The more
Exactly.
they keep putting, that'll be, so they're making a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see those things ever on TV? That's the first one I saw.
Yeah, I've
The
seen them where they,
shelters.
yeah,
The shelters.
the bomb shelters and different
they
things.
look
Yeah.
like a big
Yeah.
plain cement house
Mm-hmm.
that they drag over,
Mhm.
and they gotta get in those for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And shut them.
Well, and
20 seconds.
yeah, because they only have so much time because the
Right.
missiles are coming in. It's not very far, the distance that they're
And
traveling.
they figure, then I'm figuring that's what the Arabs are counting on. They think they're gonna flood them so much with those missiles.
Well, and then
and
that is
they're
part of
gonna
the
take them
plan.
over.
Iran has been supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Gaza Strip with all these rockets and missiles and things. And, you know, you have a system right now, the Iron Dome, and they're making advances on it all the time. And the Iron Dome has been extremely successful in shooting down these missiles. Part of what it does is it calculates where the thing is going to land. And if it's going to land out in the field somewhere, it doesn't waste anything on it. It just lets it go. If it calculates it's going to go into an industrial area or a residential area or something, then they'll shoot it down. And it's an amazing system. But if it's overwhelmed, because it has a maximum rate of fire that it can do. And if you get too many missiles coming in at once, they can't shoot them all down.
Yeah, I didn't
that's-
explain that right.
Yeah,
You got it.
and that's what Iran is banking on. And that's what the Syrians are banking on. So this push, you know, you see this desire to eliminate Israel. And Iran has been working through proxies, and they're working at it. So you've got all this going on where they believe Israel's going to be destroyed in the next 2 months.
They're gonna be surprised.
They will be surprised because it won't be destroyed.
The masses will be-
But-
Or there might be other interventions.
Yeah, God will intervene.
Right.
But here's the thing. Like I said before, doesn't matter whether we believe it's going to be destroyed in June or not. You know, a couple million Arabs believe, or Muslims believe that it will. I don't want to say Arabs because not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs. The largest Arab nation in the world is Indonesia, and they're not or I'm sorry,
Yeah,
said that
they're
wrong.
all-
Largest Muslim nation in the world is Indonesia, and they're not Arabs. So, but all these people believe it.
That's why
Yeah,
a lot of
Malaysia,
Muslims
yeah.
are turning evangelistic because
Yeah,
of the born again thing.
yeah. But I was going to say Malaysia, which again, out near Indonesia and all that, they're not Arab either. And this book with these prophecies in it is one of the best sellers in Malaysia right now. And it's read and spread far and wide in Indonesia, Malaysia, throughout the Middle East, Africa. No, just looking at the clock, I see we're at 9 o'clock there. But
This year's Ramadan is April 1st to May 1st.
yes, do they have the Ramadan Bombathon count yet?
Yeah, here it is.
25 attacks, 142 kills. So
Yeah.
far.
Out of in the name of Islam, all other religions combined, zero.
At the end of the last week of March. Also.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, the last week of March, they had 42 attacks, 130 killed, 288 injured, one suicide blast, and across 13 different countries. So it's not just Israel. Yes, and then we'll have to close.
Have you noticed how many earthquakes have been happening?
Oh, there's all that. Yeah,
Worldwide? I mean,
That's-
yeah.
we're in that season. We're looking forward to hearing that trumpet sound. So, but
So many, they're not announcing all of them.
well, you don't hear all of them. Yeah. So let's go ahead and pray because I know some people got to get going. It's after 9. So let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, I want to thank you again that we could spend some time together. Again, we thank you for the new facility, and we just thank you for everybody that's helped, prayed, and worked and labored to make this possible, Lord, to be here tonight, again, for our second Friday night Bible study here. Father, again, we thank you for the time we can spend in your word. We see what's happening in the world around us. Help us not to be defeated. Help us, Lord, to not be discouraged. Help us instead to be excited, looking forward to the soon return of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, to call us up to be with him in heaven, or to be with you in heaven. Father, bless now as we leave here tonight. Keep us safe on the roads. We do pray your blessing on the day tomorrow, but especially on the day Sunday for your glory. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, again, God bless. Good to see everybody tonight. And there's those petitions back there if you want to sign them. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off on this. So as soon as I can find it here. All right. Good night and God bless. Thanks for joining us. And Rick was on here tonight. Hey, Nancy, Rick was on here tonight. So I just saw it here. So glad to see Rick, South Dakota. That's the gentleman that's been visiting with us. He says hello to everybody. So hello, Rick. Everybody's saying hello back. So, all right. God bless. Take care. All right. We'll see you.
If the Jewish people were anything like the Muslims,